Section 9 of Richelieu by Joseph Gustave Masson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 4, The Aristocracy, Part 2. The plan the conspirators meant to carry out amounted to this. Gaston was to ask, in the first place, the right of sitting at the council board, where, by afterwards introducing D'Ornano, there was some hope of counteracting and perhaps destroying the influence of the cardinal minister. Should this plan be unsuccessful, the whole party intended to leave the court, summon their friends, fly to arms, kill the cardinal, shut up the king in a convent, and during his own lifetime obtain a dispensation from the Pope, by virtue of which Gaston would marry Anne of Austria. Duly informed of this extraordinary plot, Richelieu easily prevailed upon Louis XIII to take energetic measures. On the 4th of May, 1626, Marshal d'Ornano, on his return from hunting, was arrested at Fontainebleau and locked up at Vincennes. His two brothers and a few subaltern agents were sent to the Bastille. The scheme, thus apparently crushed, was soon started again, and there is no doubt that Richelieu's life was seriously threatened. The Count de Chalais, the two Vendôme, sons of Henry IV by Gabriel d'Estrees, the one Grand Prior of France, the other Governor of Brittany, joined in the conspiracy. The Duchesse de Chevreuse and the Count de Soissons followed their example. Richelieu, who saw the storm thickening, pretended to yield, and offered his resignation to Louis XIII. The king answered by a written assurance of implicit trust in the cardinal, and a promise of support against all those who might be induced to attack him. On the 12th of June, both the Vendômes were arrested and sent to Amboise. The Duchesse de Chevreuse was banished, and d'Ornano died at the Bastille, non sans soupçon de mort violente. Chalais, beheaded at Nantes, suffered the most horrible tortures. The executioner was so clumsy that 34 times the axe fell before the unfortunate nobleman expired. At the 20th stroke his groans were still distinctly heard. There was even a kind of trial instituted against the queen. Louis read over to her, in the presence of the cardinal, the evidence which accused her of having entertained the thought of marrying his brother. She answered contemptuously that she would not have gained sufficiently by the bargain. Threatened with a sentence of divorce, surrounded by spies, she was publicly prohibited from receiving any men in her room when the king was not there. Meanwhile, the Duc d'Orléans, anxious about his own safety, having lost all his credit, and being thoroughly disgraced in the opinion of all right-minded men, hastened to give witness against Chalais and d'Ornano. He promised to do exactly what might be required of him, even to reveal whatever should be said in his presence against either the king or the cardinal, and in order that this sad tragedy should conclude with a comedy, he married Mademoiselle de Montpensier, the ceremony being performed by Richelieu. The year 1626 was marked by an incident of an equally serious kind, although brought about by totally different circumstances. The duel between the Count de Bouteville and the Baron de Bouvron, which led to the beheading of the two champions on the Place de Grève. The passion for duelling, favoured by the weakness of a government which promulgated edicts but never saw them carried into execution, had become a kind of epidemic. Duels were fought for the most trifling causes: a glance, the colour of a doublet, sometimes even merely the absurd wish to make a display of courage and of skill in fencing. M. Victor Hugo has very strikingly illustrated this deplorable mania in the following passage from his Marion Delorme: Toujours nombre de duels. Le 3 c'était d'Angers contre d'Arquien, pour avoir porté du point de Gênes. Lavardin avec l'once se rencontre le 10, pour avoir pris à Pons la femme de Surdis. Surdis avec Dailly, pour une du théâtre de Mondori. Le 9, Nogent avec la Châtre. Pour avoir mal écrit 3 vers décolletés, Gorde avec Margaillon pour l'heure qu'il était. Dumière avec Gondi pour le pas à l'église. Et puis tu les brisas contre tous les soubises. À propos du pari d'un cheval contre un chien, enfin causade avec la tournelle pour rien. Pour le plaisir, causade à tuer la tournelle. The edict of 1609 had allowed duels to be fought, providing an inquiry was made, in the first instance, either by the king or by a special court, tribunal d'honneur. But as the majority of these encounters took place on the most trivial motives, the champions did not choose to state the pretended insults they felt bound to avenge sword in hand. Duels were of a daily occurrence, by day and by night, in the streets and the public squares, by moonlight and by torchlight. Montaigne has wittily said, "Send 3 Frenchmen in the wilderness of Libya, they will not be a month there without annoying and scratching each other." During the States General of 1614, the deputies of the 3 orders had petitioned for the suppression of this intolerable disorder. Richelieu, who lost no opportunity for holding the nobility in check and taming its turbulent spirit, promised to satisfy the petitioners. In February 1626 an edict was published doing away with the system adopted by Henry IV in his decree of 1609. Duelling was absolutely prohibited. All offenders were to be deprived of their posts and pensions, and sentenced to 3 years' banishment. 1/3 of their property was to be confiscated, and a reward given to informers. No difference was made between those who fought duels within the frontiers of the kingdom and those who went abroad for greater safety. The death of one of the champions involved a sentence of capital punishment against the other. The renewal of the offence was punished in the same manner. Duellists thought that this new edict would meet with the same fate as all previous ones, and speedily become a dead letter, but they found themselves woefully mistaken. We must not lose sight of the fact that if Richelieu prohibited duelling, he was only giving satisfaction to public opinion, which had for some time been very strongly expressed against the barbarous method adopted by the nobility of drawing the sword often as a mere pastime, and, as we should say now, to keep their hands in. He had himself, during the early part of his life, strongly felt the influence of those ideas on the point d'honneur which were so popular amongst the noblesse, and upon which they prided themselves more perhaps than any other of their privileges, certainly quite as much. Thus in 1619 his eldest brother, the Marquis de Richelieu, had been killed in a duel with the Marquis de Themines, son of the marshal of the same name. The cardinal wrote an account of this incident with such spirit and such feeling that we cannot help the persuasion that, had it not been for his ecclesiastical character, he would have only been too delighted to join in the fray. However, an example was absolutely necessary, and the affair of Bouteville furnished the opportunity. At the age of 27, Francois de Luxembourg had already fought 22 duels, and in the last his victim had been the young Comte de Tourigny. He had become a kind of living proverb. President de Chevry once answered to a man who was anxious to obtain satisfaction par les voies d'honneur: "My brave fellow, if you are so eager to fight, go and pluck a hair from Bouteville's beard. He will soon bring you to your senses." Vicomte d'Avenel remarks that the English, less admirers of brutal force than the Frenchmen of those days, saw in this luxury of courage lux de bravoure, nothing but a dangerous mania. "If that fellow sent me a written challenge," said the Marquis of Hamilton, alluding to Bouteville, "I would not receive it unless it was accompanied by a note from his medical adviser, assuring me that this desire he has of fighting does not proceed from an illness." Bouteville, protected by the Archduchess Infanta, had fled into Flanders for the purpose of avoiding the condemnations he had incurred. That princess wrote a letter to Louis XIII, asking that her guest might be forgiven. The petition was refused. Irritated at what he regarded as a piece of impertinence, Bouteville boasted of his deliberate intention to fight in France, nay, in Paris, in the Place Royale. The affair came off on the 27th of May. There were 3 champions on each side. Bouteville had for his seconds his friend Count des Chapelles and his écuyer Labert. On the other side the Baron de Bouvron was the principal. Bussy d'Amboise fought against des Chapelles, and Choquet was the adversary of Labert. Bussy was killed. The 2 domestics fled to England, while Bouteville and des Chapelles endeavoured to reach the frontier of Lorraine. They were arrested, however, at Vitry-le-Brûlé by Gordes, captain of the guards, who had recognized them and who took them to the Bastille. A few days after they were put on their trial. "The alternative is this," coolly remarked Richelieu on his report to the king, "either to cut the throat of duels or to decapitate your Majesty's edicts." The catastrophe could not be doubtful. Bouteville belonged to the Montmorency family. Princes, noblemen, courtiers vainly attempted to intercede with the king on his behalf. He and his companions were condemned by virtue of a sentence of Parliament, and beheaded on the Place de Grève, June 21st, 1627. It is curious to notice the way in which Richelieu alludes to this event. He clearly sympathizes with the 2 unfortunate men whom he has sent to the scaffold. His own feelings as a gentilhomme are aroused, and Vicomte d'Avenel very judiciously remarks that the bitterest enemy of the cardinal minister could not have used more powerful eloquence to excite the pity of the nation as to the tragic end of the duellists, and to create indignation against Richelieu. "Never," says the Memoirs, "did one see more constancy, less astonishment, more presence of mind, greater courage than in these 2 gentilshommes. They appeared before the court and answered without being in the least confused. Comte des Chapelles expressed himself with eloquence. Nothing weak in their discourses, nothing low in their actions. They received the news of their condemnation with the same composure as they would have received that of their pardon. The whole of France saw struck down by the most infamous sword in the realm those whose own weapons had always been so trusty that, without offending any one, we may honestly say that they were by far the best in the world." It was reckoned in 1609 that during the 16 previous years 4,000 gentlemen had been killed in duels. Richelieu's severity did not stop the evil, and it seemed as if the famous edict was applied reluctantly and as seldom as possible. The catalogue of the affaires d'honneur which followed the death of Bouteville, if given at full length, would be tedious. Louvigny fights with impunity against Candale at Nantes. Pralon has a duel at Blois. Liancourt sends a challenge in the king's own palace to Crescia, one of the gentlemen of his Majesty's bedchamber. A slight reprimand is the only punishment they get. The cardinal himself acknowledges that the king takes no notice of such cases unless the law is scandalously and openly violated, and even then. In 1631 the Dukes de Montmorency and de Chevreuse fight in the courtyard of the Château de Monceau, where Louis XIII was at that time residing. They are separated and merely ordered to spend a fortnight in their respective country mansions. In one single month of the year 1639 we have the duels of Armentières, Savignac, Boucau, Roquelaure, Chastellux, and many others, all unpunished. What could be expected of an age and of a country where characters existed such as that M. d'Izencourt, who met with the following reply the petition of a young cavalier anxious to obtain the hand of his niece: "Sir, you are too young to marry yet. If you are anxious to become a thorough gentleman (honnête homme), you should first kill in single combat 2 or 3 adversaries. Then you can marry and have 2 or 3 children, thus re-establishing the balance." It required some time to bring about the reform and the final suppression of these barbarous customs, but they disappeared with the transformation of the nobility and under the reign of Louis XIV. The habitués of Versailles, Saint Germain, and Marly used their swords merely as ornaments of no more importance than their bands, their lace, and their periwigs. In repressing the conspiracy of Chalais, Richelieu had at one blow struck down Anne of Austria and the Duc d'Orléans. The turn of the Queen Dowager came next. Marie de Medici, our readers will remember, had been the principal cause of the cardinal's greatness. She had obtained for him a seat at the council board, and hoped to find in him a docile instrument of her caprices. When, however, she saw the minister directing all his energies towards state affairs, and refusing to listen to her whims and to those of her second and favourite son Gaston, she resolved upon accomplishing the disgrace of him whom she called an ungrateful servant. Never, says a contemporary document, was a faction so powerful in any state. It would be easier to name those who did not belong to it than those who did. The king was at that time seriously ill at Lyons. Physicians and astrologers had said that he could not possibly recover, and assembled around his bedside. Guise, Bassompierre, Bellegarde, and a number of other courtiers were already speculating on the probable consequences of the cardinal's disgrace and death. Louis XIII, feeling that his own life was in a very precarious condition, sent for Montmorency and recommended to him the interests of the minister. A crisis meanwhile took place, September 30th, 1630, and all causes of anxiety disappeared. The 2 queens, unremitting in their attentions to the invalid, asked in the name of gratitude the dismissal of a statesman to whom they ascribed both their own sufferings and the misfortunes of France. Weary of these ceaseless complaints, Louis hastily promised everything, asking only that the change contemplated in the direction of affairs might be postponed till after the war. At the same time he cautioned affectionately Richelieu that the Queen Mother was dissatisfied with him, and he recommended to him a sincere reconciliation. During the trip down the Loire from Rouen to Briare, Marie de Medici and Richelieu were in the same boat. She hoped, says Richelieu himself, that she would more easily be able to have her own will and crush her servant with greater ease, the less he was on his guard against it, and she looked at him with a kindly eye, accepted his dutiful attentions and respects as usual, and spoke to him with as much appearance of confidence as if she had wholly given it to him. The cardinal firmly believed that he had regained all his influence, but on the return of the royal party to Paris, the king was requested by his mother to keep his promise. The news of the relief of Casale seemed to foreshadow the end of the war. Exasperated by the resistance of her son, Marie de Medici determined at any rate upon proving to the cardinal that if he was not dismissed from office, the fault was not on her side. On the 9th of November, the superintendence of her own household was taken away from Richelieu. His favourite niece, the Marchioness de Combalet, who also held a post at court, was disgracefully insulted in the presence of the king and expelled from the palace. The captains of the guards and other officers who had been appointed on Richelieu's recommendation were dismissed. An interview granted to the cardinal only resulted in his being covered with abuse, and treated in the most ignominious manner by the wayward and infuriated queen. On the next day, Marie de Medici, shutting herself up with Louis XIII., made a last effort to encompass her ends. The king requested his mother to put off for 6 weeks or 2 months the grand move against the cardinal, for the sake of the affairs of his kingdom, which were then at their crisis, when all of a sudden the cardinal arrived. Finding the door of the chamber closed, he entered the gallery and went and knocked at the door of the cabinet, where he obtained no answer. Tired of waiting, and knowing the ins and outs of the mansion, he entered by the little chapel, where the king was somewhat dismayed, and said to the queen in despair, "Here he is," thinking no doubt that he would blaze forth. The cardinal, who perceived their dismay, said to them, "I am sure you were speaking about me." The queen answered, "We were not." Whereupon he having replied, "Confess it, madam," she said, "Yes," and immediately conducted herself with great tartness towards him, reproaching him in her half Italian, half French jargon for his duplicity and his ingratitude. Neither the tears nor the protestations of the cardinal were able to calm the passionate woman, who kept asking the king if he preferred a lackey to his own mother. As much frightened at the queen as at Richelieu, Louis XIII. Left hurriedly the room, but in starting for his hunting box at Versailles, he ordered the keeper of the seals, Michel de Marillac, to accompany him. The whole court believed that the cardinal was irretrievably lost, and flocked to the Luxembourg, where the queen mother, instead of following the king, as prudence would have told her to do, and preventing him from being surrounded by other influences, was blazing forth her triumph. Messengers were dispatched in all directions to spread the welcome news, and Richelieu, on his own side, was busy giving orders to prepare for his own departure. He intended to go first to Pontoise, and from thence to Havre. At that moment Cardinal de la Valette came to him, urging him to stand firm even in the face of the dangers by which he appeared to be surrounded, and almost simultaneously a messenger dispatched by Saint-Simon, the father of the celebrated memoir writer, arrived, ordering him to Versailles with all possible speed. The queen had supposed, said Richelieu, that her private authority as mother, and the pious affection and honour the king showed her as her son, would prevail over the public care which he ought as king to take of his kingdom and his people. But God, who holds in his hands the hearts of princes, disposed things otherwise. His Majesty resolved to defend his servant against the malice of those who prompted the queen to this wicked design. The king, on seeing him, showed such joy and received him with such proofs of affection that he made him thoroughly to understand how ill-advised he would have been to adopt another course. He immediately closeted himself with Richelieu, and they both determined upon what was to be done under the circumstances, both within the realm and without. Henceforth the alliance between the king and the cardinal was indissolubly sealed. The Luxembourg became as deserted as it had been thronged a few hours before, and the queen mother found out that her last chance was gone. Such was the famous episode to which the name of Journée des Dupes has been given. It had its victims, just as the conspiracy of Chalais. The two brothers Marillac, the one keeper of the seals, the other Marshal of France, had been too prompt in joining Marie de Medici's triumph. The former was dismissed from his office and arrested. He died of decline at Châteaudun. The latter, seized by Marshal Schomberg in the midst of the army he commanded in Piedmont, was transferred first to Saint-Menehould and afterwards to Verdun, where he had to stand his trial on a charge not of treason but of peculation. This was a crime of common occurrence in those days, and most generals contrived to enrich themselves either by defrauding their subordinates of their pay, or by receiving allowances in money and provisions for non-effective soldiers, etc. Public opinion was of all times very indignant at scandals of that kind, and received with unfeigned satisfaction the intelligence that a general had been found guilty and severely punished. It was therefore a clever move on the part of Richelieu to fasten upon Marillac an accusation which, whether well founded or not, would be certain to predispose everybody against him. "It is a very strange thing," exclaimed the Marshal, "to persecute me as they do. My trial is a mere question of hay, straw, wood, stones, and lime. There is not case enough for whipping a servant." The Marshal's trial lasted 18 months, and the court of inquiry was transferred from Verdun to Ruel, in Richelieu's own house. Marillac was condemned to death by a majority of one voice only, and beheaded on the 10th of May, 1632. Marie de Medici had been banished to Compiegne. When she saw herself finally abandoned by her son, she fled to Brussels, where she lived for a short time under the protection of the Spaniards, and died, 1631, in a state almost bordering upon destitution. End of Section 9.